Hello, everyone. It is right on 11, just after, so any last-minute stragglers can make their way on, but we will get started just to be aware of time. So hello and welcome, everyone. I am Audrey Thorstead, Programming Associate at the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, or HMML, as many people know it. This is the first gathering of our winter lecture series this year in 2025. We hope you'll join us for the next one. We are hosting these every fourth Wednesday of the month through April on Zoom, so same time, same place. One goal we have for this series is to provide a platform for scholars to share findings they've uncovered through the study of manuscripts, both physical and digital, cared for in our collections, while at the same time getting people excited about what manuscripts can tell us. And indeed, getting excited about manuscripts is something HMML does really well. If you're new here, HMML is an international organization based out of Minnesota in the United States. Our purpose is to preserve and share the world's handwritten past to inspire a deeper understanding of our present and future. Handwritten books, or manuscripts, are clues documenting what humans over thousands of years thought important enough to share and write down. It's incredible what these voices from the past have to tell and teach us. Therefore, we photograph manuscripts around the world so their contents can be made available for centuries to come. We place a special priority on manuscripts located in regions endangered by war, political instability, or other threats. Preservation begins through partnerships with local libraries, agreements that allow HMML to take digital images of the manuscripts in the collections. Digitization is done entirely through local teams to whom we provide equipment, training, technical support, and payment for their work. We photograph everything in a collection because we don't know what might be significant in the future. Copies of the digital images are given to the library or archive that hold the manuscripts, and another copy comes to HMML in Minnesota. HMML employs catalogers and other staff to ensure that digital images of these manuscripts are identified, supported for long-term access, and made freely available to the public via our website. Scholars from all around the world will visit HMML both physically at our location on St. John's University campus and virtually in our virtual reading room on our website, which houses millions of photographs of manuscripts. This series gives us an opportunity to hear from these scholars whose work enhances and increases our understanding of the manuscripts in our collections. Programs like this are free and open to the public thanks to the generosity of the community of donors. Our work is solely funded by donations and grants. Please consider donating to HMML online at hmml.org. Your donation will allow for the continued effort in preserving our global cultural heritage. Today's lecture will be around 40 minutes in length, and we will then have time for questions at the end. For this lecture, we're using the Q&A chat function. This can be found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Feel free to type your question anytime during the presentation, and we will get to as many as we can today. Now for the main event, why everyone is here. Our guest speaker today is no stranger to HMML, and we are very lucky to have him kicking off our winter lecture series. Dr. Jan Vandeburie obtained his PhD in medieval studies at the University of Kent in 2015, and he specializes in religious and cultural interactions between the East and West in the medieval Mediterranean. He has held many research positions, including multiple fellowships at HMML, and most recently with the NEA and Mellon Foundation at the Vatican Museum Library at St. Louis University. Dr. Vandeburie currently divides his time between the University of Manchester and the Woolf Institute in Cambridge, where he is a research associate. He has many publications, including his recent research on the writings of Jacques de Vitry, who we'll hear about today, on shared sacred spaces and knowledge exchange between the East and West in medieval Europe. So without further ado, welcome and thank you for joining us today. I hope you enjoy the presentation. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Audrey. Can you hear me okay? Very good. Thank you all for coming. I'm glad to see some familiar faces, familiar names at least on the participants list. And thank you again, Audrey, for introducing and for having me as well. And the Himmel for having me indeed multiple times throughout the past years. It's a wonderful place to work. And I hope to share some of my, as Audrey already said, enthusiasm about manuscripts with the audience today. My talk today will focus on a particular collection at the Himmel, the Hinnebusch archive, and I'll talk a bit more about how that particular collection and archive ended up there in Minnesota. And then I'll focus more on Jacques de Vitry, who is indeed was the topic of my PhD, but also the topic of a few of my publications. And then I'll end with a few particular case studies of manuscripts to get you through. Make sure. Here we go. To get you through some examples of what it's like to work with manuscripts. I want to start with this image. This is the Hinnebusch family from Pennsylvania. At least the seven out of 10 siblings who joined the Dominican order. And the youngest one to the left of the back row is John Frederick, or Fred Hinnebusch, born in 1923 in Pennsylvania. John Frederick, let's call him Fred, went on to study at the Catholic University of America in Washington, did an MA in medieval history there, and then went on to teach at Providence College in Rhode Island before he went off to Freiburg in Switzerland to join the Albertinum Priory, a famous hub of research in Switzerland, to work on his doctoral work for his PhD on Jacques de Vitry, the 13th century preacher I'll tell you more about today. In 1973, he published this edition of one of Jacques de Vitry's texts, the so-called Historia Occidentalis, or the History of the West. In it, Jacques de Vitry covers an overview of what the church, the Latin church, the Catholic church in the West was like, covering all kinds of different orders and monastic communities. But my focus today will be on a second book that's part of this endeavor, the Historia Orientalis, but more on that in a moment. Fred Hinnebusch in 1980 was called to join the so-called Leonine Commission, a Dominican project that focused on collecting and editing all the works of Thomas Aquinas. And in an article in 1997, he wrote in Scriptorium, he wrote that he, because of the project on Aquinas, and now at this point, he said, old age, he was forced to abandon his research, his PhD research on Jacques de Vitry's writings. And throughout this research, throughout his years in Switzerland, he did collect an awful lot of not just copies and notes, but also microfilms. So the digitization, the way in which we could make copies of medieval manuscripts. And as he notes in the article here, he had gifted back then to the, as it was called, the Hill Monastic Microfilm Library, he had gifted his entire collection of notes and microfilms for future scholars to use. And I want to be at this point already, I'm very grateful to the work of Fred Hinnebusch. As we all say, we stand on the shoulders of giants, so that scholars today can continue his research and use his notes. People like me, but also colleagues like Jesslyn Bird, for example, have done tremendous work using his material at the Himmel. And also thank the Himmel for keeping this collection intact and for letting scholars have access to it and keeping all these notes and everything that goes with it together, at least. It's rare these days that libraries are happy to keep paper notes in boxes. So thank you for that. But so let's go. I meant to say that sadly, Fred Hinnebusch passed away in 2018, so not too long ago. Then I want to go back in time a bit more to the Middle Ages, to the 12th century and 13th century, to the life and career, first of all, of Jacques de Vitry, who was he was born or grew up in Vitry-en-Perthois in the north of France, went on to study in Paris, and then ended up as a canon at the Priory of Saint-Nicolas de Wagny in what is now Belgium, in Namur, what was then imperial territory. And this is important to look at this map because the county of Champagne in France back then was a hotbed of crusading endeavors and crusading enthusiasm. And this is the context in which we have to sort of place Jacques de Vitry's career, but also his writings. So in a nutshell, and I'm happy to answer questions about any of this after the talk has ended, at that point in time, so by the late 11th century, the First Crusade had miraculously made its way to the Middle East, to Jerusalem, and had taken control of Jerusalem. And along the way, they had founded these, as you can see on the map, 4 so-called Crusader states. Perhaps the main reason, credible or foolish, depending on how you look at it, endeavor was successful because they were sort of acting as a buffer between these 2 much larger Muslim empires, the Seljuk Empire and the Fatimid Caliphate. This did not last very long, and by the time that Jacques de Vitry is a young man and is studying and goes on to be a student in Paris, Saladin, the Egyptian and Sultan of Egypt and Syria, have managed to claw back most of those territories, as you can see on the map on the screen, and he had defeated the Christian armies of the Crusader armies, at least in 1187 at the Battle of Hattin, not just taking control of Jerusalem, but also taking away their relic of the Holy Cross, as you can see in this quite graphic manuscript image. But that's the context of Jacques de Vitry's career. Basically, in the West, the shock of losing Jerusalem had caused quite a stir, and a pope like Innocent III, who came into power in 1198, was determined to take control over Jerusalem again, but also to put the church straight, to kind of reform the church and try and get some order and hierarchy established, with obviously him as the pope on top of it. And to that purpose, he called together the so-called Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, which had 2 purposes. On the one hand, reforming the church and trying to create order in the Western Catholic Church. And on the other hand, trying to have a successful crusade to take back control over Jerusalem. And these two purposes is what will send Jacques to the Middle East at that time. But first, let's go back to Jacques' career as a student, because along with Innocent III, Innocent III also studied at Paris as a theology student. And not so long afterwards, Jacques will do so as well. And this explains how he was so close to the papacy, to Innocent III, and how he then got his position as Bishop of Acre in the Holy Land later on. And I've been trying to use contemporary writings by Jacques, as well as manuscripts, to sort of visualize his career and his writings. When he was a student at Paris, he seemed to not have had a very great time. And he complained that, and I quote here from his Historia Occidentalis, which Hinnebusch edited, almost all the students at Paris, foreigners and natives, did absolutely nothing except learn or hear something new. Some studied merely to acquire knowledge, which is curiosity, others to acquire fame, which is vanity, others still for the sake of gain, which is cupidity, and the vice of simony. Very few, he said, studied for their own edification, or that of others. And we could argue that times maybe not have changed that much. He also complains about how there's constant fighting between the nations, the different people from different countries who are in Paris. And he calls the English drunkards, and they had tails. He calls the sons of France proud, effeminate, and carefully adorned. He calls the Germans furious and obscene. And then the one I can fairly agree with myself is that he calls the Flemish fickle, prodigal, gluttonous, and yielding as butter, and slothful. Anyway, it sounds like he didn't like his time as a student very much. But then again, we have to think about him in the context of preaching, and in the context of when he writes this later on, as he already has a career as a preacher, he's trying to make a point. And he's trying to, in this case, because shortly afterwards, his close colleague, Robert of Courson, will reform the University of Paris into what is today still basically. And so he's trying to say that before the reform of Robert of Courson, the place was terrible. So that's his sort of context. So even though this text is used in a lot of teaching, it wasn't all that bad. Nonetheless, in Yale Beinecke Library, there is a manuscript which has as a little inscription on it that this book, this grammar book, belonged to Jacques de Vitry himself. And interestingly, if you go through it, there's a lot of annotations and doodles, clearly perhaps being a bit bored, that likely are, could be from Jacques or a later student, but the chances are. But nonetheless, it shows what students were doing at the time, not very different from now, supposedly. The next phase in Jacques' life is when he hears about someone called Marie Doigny. Marie Doigny was a so-called holy woman who was very ascetic and lived a very sort of self-deprivating life near Namur in current-day Belgium. And he heard of her and her reputation, and he decided to join her. He left his studies at Paris to join the priory of Saint-Nicolas of Oigny, where Mary of Oigny was also based. And they start to have a very good relationship as her confessor, and he ends up writing a vita. So he ends up writing a saint's life about Mary to try and elevate her to the status of saint after her death. And one interesting thing here is that this object on the side here is a so-called phylactery. It's a portable reliquary, and in this case, it holds the finger of Mary of Oigny. And there's a few interesting stories where Jacques, he was carrying this finger around his neck. This was after her death, obviously. He was carrying the finger around his neck with him on his travels, and there's several stories where a shipwreck is avoided or he's rescued from a storm by kind of holding on to Mary's memory. And that specific phylactery with the finger is still there in Brussels, at least today. And this reliquary is part of, and this is a side point, but something I really want to mention here, part of a bigger collection, of an amazing collection of all sorts of reliquaries, relics, gold work. Many relics that are contained in these vessels were brought back by Jacques himself and gifted to the Priory of Oigny. And they are still intact as one collection, as a snapshot in time, because at the French Revolution, when a lot of these monastic and church treasures were being stolen by the French government, the local people hid the treasure in the farm of a local farmer. And that makes that today we still have this intact treasure, which really interestingly includes basically the entire set of Jacques de Vitry's episcopal attributes, as when he was appointed bishop of Acco in the Holy Land. We have his episcopal rings, his manipule, his staff, and also two mitres, one embroidered showing the martyrdom of Thomas Becket, but the other one is a fantastic, unique in the world, illuminated parchment mitre. And for those of you who like manuscripts and who haven't heard of this one yet, this is a amazing object. Very briefly, so that the front of it shows Christ in Majesty on top, with in the middle then Mary, and then in the center we have a non-named, undefined bishop, but basically the bishop. So when he's wearing this, and I'll talk about this in a moment, it really kind of projects the power and authority of a bishop, aside from the sort of the bling of wearing this at official occasions. But more on this in just a moment. We also have a lovely portable altar, which is particularly small, and it shows how he would use this to go around in the Holy Land without much of an entourage, having to move and go around fast. I'll talk about this in a moment as well, to preach across the different Christian communities. So you would have needed a small and pocket-sized portable altar to do this. He became famous as a preacher in the West still when Mary of Oigny, at least that's how the story goes, sent him to preach for the Albigensian Crusade, which was a crusade that was called in France against the Cathars or the heretics in the south of France. And on the one hand, in his Vita of Mary of Oigny, Jacques is very sort of humble in a way. And he notes that he was unworthy of preaching the word of God and that he didn't have the experience or the practice. And he seemed quite insecure about whether he was doing a good job. And this insecurity is going to be interesting later on in his life when we talk about what happened in the Holy Land. And he notes that once it happened after I had given a sermon that I returned to myself and experienced a certain sluggishness of mind. It seemed to me that I had said much that was disordered and badly organized, and that's always my concern as well whenever I'm giving a talk like this. So I hope that's not too bad. Nonetheless, on the other hand, we have Thomas of Cantimbré's account, where he says that about Jacques, there's shown forth in him a special miracle. By the prayers and merits of the most blessed woman, so Mary of Oigny, he reached in a short time such a preeminence in preaching that scarcely any mortal could equal him in expounding the scriptures and destroying sin. And that's really important to note here, that he was one of the most famous preachers of his time, which will impact as well how much his manuscripts and his writings were also held in high esteem, but also spread and copied afterwards. For example, he was one of the first ones at the 13th century to have these, as the image shows, sermones ad status, and they are collections of, for the first time, sermons for particular occasions, in particular audiences at least. So sermons for lawyers, sermons for crusaders, among others, sermons for any kind of professions. Plus, they were collected and used as model sermons for other preachers to use. Plus, they had, like you can see here, these handy indexes. They were really kind of innovative and revolutionary in a way in institutionalizing the practice of preaching in Europe at that time. But his reputation as a preacher gets him to be appointed by Innocent III, but by the time he makes the journey to Italy, he finds Innocent III dead, and his successor, Honorius III, Pope Honorius III, confirms his appointment as Bishop of Saint-Jean d'Acre, current-day Akko in current-day Israel at the coast. And this is where I sort of put this image of that parchment mitre. It's a reconstruction done by a project called Chromios in Belgium, where they used his bones, Jacques de Vitry's skeletal remains, as well as the objects that we have of him, to reconstruct how he would have looked like as a bishop, including the attributes. And this particular kind of mitre is interesting here because, as you can see in this quote from his letters he sent back from the East, he said that, "I found the town of Acre like a monster or a beast, having 9 heads, each fighting the other. I found that there were men who were disobedient to our church, and these were the Italians, that they wouldn't listen to him and refused to come to his sermon. He also found locals, which he called Pulani, local Latin Christians that weren't accustomed to hear the word of God. And he found foreigners that had fled as outlaws or criminals from Europe to the Holy Land." So he really finds himself not just in this environment, but also in a city where, as you could see on the map I showed earlier, Jerusalem at that point was no longer under Christian control, which meant that all the bishops and all the church leaders who had their sees, who had their little domains in these crusader states, all were gathered in this one remaining major city of Acre. So he arrived as the bishop of the city, but surrounded by other bishops. So it makes sense that he would have needed something like this very imposing and shiny mitre to establish his authority, or at least try to. This is where we get to the second mitre he had, which shows martyrdom at the back of St. Thomas of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, and the front, the martyrdom of St. Lawrence, 2 bishops that were killed. And that quite fits with how he found his time in the Holy Land. He doesn't like the situation in Acre. At the same time, he goes around, as he calls it, there's a reference to 1 Corinthians 15. He had to fight with the beast at Ephesus, like Paul had to do at Ephesus. He compares himself to the Apostle Paul. And he tries to reach the Eastern Christian community, but also Muslims, by using interpreters, as the local population would have spoken Arabic. Nonetheless, he sort of reminisces in this quote here at the bottom that he's looking forward to the arrival of the pilgrims meaning the Crusaders, for he thinks that it's going to be easy, and there's lots of division among the Saracens. Saracens are the Muslims, and that is going to be easy to convert him even to Christianity. Then we get to the 5th Crusade. The 5th Crusade, like any other crusade after the first one, was unsuccessful. They tried to attack Egypt. I won't go into details, but they besieged Damietta, took control of it, but then were besieged themselves and had to give it up. But Jacques was part of this crusading army in Egypt. And he also witnessed, for example, the supposed attempt by St. Francis to convert Sultan Al-Kamil, the Egyptian Sultan. St. Francis supposedly left the camp, tried to have an audience with the Sultan, and tried to convince him to convert to Christianity, which evidently didn't work very well. But the failure of the crusade, as well as then the failure of sort of famous conversion attempts like this one, led to Jacques getting very disappointed. And disappointed is perhaps a euphemism, because it looks like he was suffering from either a mental health breakdown or at the very least a burnout, if you would want to use a modern term. There's a really interesting letter in the Vatican archives, which is addressed from the Pope to Jacques de Vitry specifically, so only to him. It's not addressed to anybody else, which is a rare occasion. Usually it's a group letter. And he says that, and I selected here a few lines, he said, the Pope, to Jacques, like a good soldier of Christ, you have hitherto fought a good fight, but now I've heard you're desiring a retreat, and we cannot but grieve gravely at this. And he's trying to convince him to keep going, keep up the strength and the preaching, because soon enough, Frederick II, the German emperor, would arrive with a fortification, with sort of reinforcements for the crusade, which never happened, by the way, or at least not at the time that Jacques was there. And this seems to have sort of caused him to leave the Holy Land. He kept his position as Bishop of Acre for a while, but he personally left back to Europe. And seems to be the time when he starts to write sort of what the text that we'll talk about a bit more in just a moment. He ends up as being appointed eventually after his stint as Bishop of Acre as Cardinal of Tusculum. And Thomas of Cantimpré, again, this time a bit less positive, comments on this. And he notes that Jacques occupies a see in the Roman Curia as a bishop and cardinal. He studies the scriptures, so I heard, suited and quiet. Meanwhile, souls without counsel or help are headed towards hell. Where's the fervor of conscientious preaching? Rumor has it in our part of the world that there you give little or no thoughts to these things now. So they're quite, Thomas and the community are quite annoyed with him, that he sort of, and you know, as I said, I think this is signs of a burnout, that he was retreating in Rome. And as we can see on this document linked to a Benedictine abbey near Salzburg, he signs over 111 papal documents, which is more than any other person for a century before or after him, which means that he was constantly in Rome and sort of became an administrator, basically. Anyway, Jacques dies in 1240 and then sends a lot of more gifts and books specifically to the Priory of Saint Nicolas of Oigny. Now, I kind of gave this overview of his life and career in a nutshell. To be fair, there's much more to be said. To give some context to what he's writing as well. Because when you look at the manuscript tradition of Jacques de Vitry's Historia, Hierosolymitana, Abbreviata, so the short history of Jerusalem, as it's called in Latin, which includes the Historia Orientale, so the history of the East, about the Holy Land, the history of the West, which is the one that Hinnebusch edited, and a third book, which I'll talk about in just a moment. We need to kind of link this to certain moments in his life, and we can link this to the manuscripts and how the text is being copied while he was still alive. First of all, we can link the origins of the text, the beginning of his writing, at least in his own words, to the siege of Damietta, when the Crusaders were sitting in Damietta, had conquered the city on the Fifth Crusade, and were, as we can see in the text, bored, dehydrated, languishing with boredom, as they were also waiting to march on to Cairo. But there wasn't much they could do, and they, in the end, will be besieged themselves and will have to give up the city. But Jacques, desiring to learn new things, as he said, was going through the cupboards of the locals and found various books in Latin, in Greek, and in Arabic about the stories of the kings of the East. And he kind of, puts it on himself to tell these stories, to start writing about this information that he finds. Of course, this is a typical prologue of the time where he tries to kind of, be very humble as well, which is a more of an authorial spiel than anything else. But nonetheless, that seems to be the time when he seems to have found the time to sit down and actually focus on writing his history of Jerusalem, or at least conceiving of it. Later on in the prologue, he sets out what he wants to do. In the first book, he says he focuses on the countries of the East and the races of the inhabitants, the cities, and the different holy places. In the second book, he focuses on the countries of the West, where he covers the various orders, regular and secular. And then in the third book, he says, I will then return to the East, and I will talk about he would talk about the events that happened after the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 and what's happening on the Fifth Crusade. And you can see at that point, he's still confident that the crusade will be successful. He ends this prologue by saying that he hopes to complete this book with the recapture of the Holy Land and the conversion or destruction of the Saracens. He also points out, he addresses his readers then, and this is interesting for us to see what his intention was behind this book. As he said, it was as a good example for those who fight under the banner of Christ, to strengthen the faith, reform the morals, refute the infidels, confuse the impious people, and finally to celebrate the praises of good men, and others to then follow these deeds of good men. Now, the rest of my talk, I want to focus on the Historia Orientalis, so the first book in this combined endeavor. Very quickly running through its very rich content, it has an entire section on Islam and different Muslim groups, then a long section on the history of the Crusades. It continues to cover an elaborate section on the holy places in the Holy Land, in the Middle East, and then talks about the different Latin Christian groups in the East. So the Italians, the European nations, and the various religious orders. It then covers the different Eastern Christian communities, as well as the Jewish communities. And interestingly, at the end of it, and I'll talk about this at the end of this talk, he covers a really rich set of chapters on the natural world, on fauna and flora, climate, and any kind of scientific marvels. And then he ends with the current events around Saladin, or the recent events around Saladin and the Third Crusade. Now, at the end of my talk now, I want to sort of focus on 4 case studies, and depending what Audrey says, I may cut one. But to show the audience, without going into too much technical detail, what it's like to research this topic through the manuscripts and what we can find from this. And the 4 case studies are focusing, first of all, on the third book. Then I'll focus on the way in which the Orientalis was used as a book about Islam, Liber Mahometi, a book about Muhammad, how it was also used as a pilgrimage guide at the time, and also how it really spiked the interest of people in the West by including so much information about animals and plants and the natural wonders. On your right, you can see what's called a stemma, which is what researchers try to establish when researching a medieval text through manuscripts, figuring out which text is copied from which one and what has changed in that text. Because obviously with every handmade copy, certain changes are made, deliberate or not, and that impacts how the text is then passed on. And as you can see, I circled 2 particular events here. When we get the first copy of the Historia Orientalis by itself, in fact, coming from the Middle East, it does not have the so-called third book that he announced in his prologue with it yet. Only a few kind of steps down the line, in the second circle there, suddenly a third book is added. And if we go back to what happened with his disappointment in the East, everything points to the fact that he stopped his writing at the end, or before even the end, of the Historia Occidentalis, the second book, and never started a third book. How come we talk about a third book then, though, in the manuscript? And this is a first interesting case study. And I'll take you back to, and all of these, by the way, I've investigated largely in the Himmel, but I'm using images that are a bit more sharp and colorful than the microfilms of the Himmel. But all these manuscripts are indeed also on microfilm available in the Himmel. So I want to take you to this manuscript from Paris, from the mid-13th century, a very early one. As it sort of ends, as you can see, and I'll zoom in a bit more, on this side, on the left-hand side, the Historia Occidentalis, or Book 2, ends abruptly. It seems to just stop. Whether or not this isn't linked to Jacques, by the way, there's no evidence to suggest that he wrote this particular copy. But it does suggest that there was no third book to be added. However, we do find then clearly as a separate text written by a different hand, so different handwriting, a text about the context of the time, about Innocent III looking for information about the Muslims in the Holy Land. And in this case, there's no connection yet being made between those two. Later on, however, and this is where we get to an example like the Vatican manuscript Regina Latina 504 in the early 14th century, where a scribe, so a copier of the text, seems to have seen the previous manuscript, or at least they're from the same context, or at least a copy of that one, and assumed that by looking at the prologue, there's a third book, and then this edition was assumed to be that third book. Hence, we get at the start, we get a sort of more fluent, by the same scribe, edition of that text that we find separately in the previous one, and a little title added that says, "Here starts the next treatise," so meaning the third book of Jacques de Vitry's work. So this is sort of just a small example of how we can explain, and by delving into the manuscripts, where the confusion tends to start. The second case study is the Orientalis as a Liber Mahometi, and this is sort of showing you how at the time it was used in the high intellectual theological circle. This is a copy from the Vatican Library as well, from the 15th century, where Jacques de Vitry's book is copied alongside big important texts about Islam, about refuting Islam by Dominican missionaries. And interestingly, and you can't quite see it very well, but in a marginal note, Jacques' book is not identified as Historia Orientalis, but identified as Liber Mahometi, as the book of Mohammed, which shows us again the way in which these are used. And Jacques indeed quotes the Quran extensively. He knew about the Quran in Latin from his times in Paris. So it would have been a useful treatise for people researching Islam at the time. So that's the second, or sort of one of the instances in which we see copies being spread and used of the Historia Orientalis. The third case study then is when we look at the popularity of the work in the East. And this is an interesting particular case where when I was working in the Vatican Film Library in St. Louis, it turns out that a manuscript was wrongly catalogued as a work of Jacques de Vitry, and instead was the work of indeed Jacques, sections of it, along with other Dominican writers about the Holy Land. And basically, what this was, I'll go back to this in a moment, was a Franciscan so-called, if you will, rough guide to the Holy Land. The Franciscans had remained in the Holy Land, taken charge of the custody of Jerusalem, as it was called, of the Holy Sepulchre at least. And they would give pilgrims these sort of copies, cheap-made copies of pilgrimage guides to help them on their travels. And I found this manuscript by coincidence because it wasn't listed anymore as being one of Jacques, because nobody could get access to it as it was falling apart by now. It's one of those cheaply made ones from the Holy Land itself. And interestingly, when I then went to the Himmel, I found a note, and this shows you kind of that conversation, if you will, with Fred Hinnebusch, a note where he also very briefly kind of points out the discrepancies between the cataloging of this text and what actually is inside this manuscript. I can talk a bit more about this later on. And then my final example is looking at the popularity of the work then in the West. So not among pilgrims, but among popular audiences. And many of the manuscripts of Jacques Orientalis contain these really interesting notes or extra divisions at the chapters that talk about animals. And people loved, like today, strange animals and beasts. And you can see that many of the manuscripts were either annotated in that way, or even in this case in Lucca in Italy, retitled De Mirabilibus Mundi, about the miracles of the world. And indeed, Jacques' text contains a lot of new information, also some misleading information where he assumes, for example, in this case, that the camel carrying the kiswa from Cairo every year to Mecca is in fact the chimera. So things like this obviously spike the interest and fantasy of the people in the West. But we can also see in the manuscript that, at least in this case in Oxford, a scribe had left space to include colorful images, like in the many other bestiaries that we have at the time in Europe, to include those in this text, but it never happened, which again testifies to the particular focus of interest in the animals in the text. Anyway, to conclude, I think that the encyclopedic nature of Jacques de Vitry's compendium of knowledge about the Holy Land ensured a lasting impact in the Middle Ages. It was used by pilgrims in the East, by preachers in the West, by missionaries among Muslims, by historians, obviously, but also by popular audiences who were looking for entertainment or a so-called virtual pilgrimage. Those who couldn't go to the Holy Land could use this text or could listen to this text being read to them, and the rich detail about the natural world, for example, to imagine really lively what the biblical places looked like. And then in a more general note, I think sort of this kind of research is necessary, where you have to combine the historical and the biographical research into a text and an author, but also combine that with in-depth manuscript research, looking into what else is copied in the same volume, and how that text seems to have been used, and for what purpose it was copied at the time, because that changes and is always different throughout the centuries. And I want to end with a quote from Jacques himself, which shows despite collecting all kinds of information, it shows also his critical thinking, or warning his readers to think critically, where he says that if perhaps something seems incredible to someone, we do not, so he does not compel anyone to believe it. Each one is free to his own opinion. However, we do not consider it dangerous to believe things that are not against faith or good morals. And perhaps in society today, it's important to keep these kind of things in mind, to keep thinking critically. That's it for me. Happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really wonderful presentation and journey through some of our collections. It's always fun to hear how people can use our resources and the fun things they find. I love the doodles, for example, from the school textbooks. That's so fun to think of parallels to our own time.